Ladies and gentlemen, today we're going to about how to dismantle and ultimately destroy the psychological grip of a cruel narcissist, not through rage or revenge, but through neuroscience-backed action. A narcissist, particularly the cruel type, isn't just arrogant. They're addicted to control. They're wired to feed off emotional responses, positive or negative. And once you understand that system, you can shut it down surgically and systematically. Narcissists rely on what psychologists refer to as a narcissistic supply, a constant stream of attention, admiration, emotional reactions, and validation. It doesn't matter whether that reaction is positive or negative. Praise, outrage, adoration, or fear. It's all fuel. This supply functions like oxygen to a narcissist's sense of identity, which is inherently fragile, hollow, and dependent on external validation to survive. Understanding this dynamic is the single most powerful insight you can leverage to dismantle their influence over you. When you engage with a narcissist, arguing, defending yourself, explaining your perspective, or even retaliating, you're feeding the very system they thrive on. You're reinforcing their belief that they matter more, that they have emotional control. That they're capable of pulling your strings. That response, whether it comes from love or anger, gives them the validation they seek. The more intense the emotional energy, the more potent the supply. So paradoxically, even your rage becomes nourishment for them. To cut a narcissist off from this supply is not simply about going no contact. It's about removing the emotional energy you previously gave them, consciously or unconsciously. You must learn to detach internally as well as externally. That means no longer responding in a way that gives them power. Silence isn't just the absence of words, it's the absence of emotional engagement. It's your nervous system saying, you do not affect me anymore. Neurologically, this is powerful. When you stop giving emotional cues, tone, facial expressions, gestures, the narcissist's brain experiences disorientation. They're constantly scanning for reactions to manipulate. When there's nothing to read, nothing to hijack, they lose grip. This is akin to their psychological foundation cracking. Their need for control goes unmet, and because they lack internal stability, they begin to unravel. Cutting off supply is not revenge, it's survival. It's the reassertion of your own nervous system, your own focus, and your own identity. You are saying, through your behavior and your stillness, I no longer serve your reality, and that is excruciating for them. They depend on others to reflect their false sense of superiority. Without someone to manipulate, criticize, or idealize, they're left alone with the void they've been avoiding their entire life. The difficult part is that narcissists will escalate when the supply is cut. They will provoke, bait, charm, guilt trip, or play the victim. This is a critical moment. Your job is to not engage, no matter how tempting it feels to defend your integrity. They want that fence. It signals emotional investment. What they fear most is your complete coldness, not cruelty. View indifference. It communicates that their power is gone. People often think silence is weakness, but strategically applied, silence is neurological warfare. It disrupts the narcissist's feedback loop. When you stop responding, you interrupt the cycle of validation they need to function. Think of it as cutting off the blood supply to a tumor. The more you withhold your energy, the faster their influence shrinks. What makes this approach even more powerful is that it's rooted in control. Not of them, but of yourself. The real work is in training your own mind and body to no longer react. That may mean practicing emotional regulation techniques, deep breathing, somatic awareness, directing thoughts, and visualizing your calm state as a fortress. Over time, your system adapts to neutrality. Your reactions no longer betray your inner world. And in the absence of chaos, the narcissist finds nothing to manipulate. Some people ask, isn't that cruel? No. What's cruel is allowing yourself to be exploited over and over. Cutting off supply is an act of protection, not punishment. It's a signal to your own brain that you are done outsourcing your peace. You are done dancing around someone else's dysfunction. You are choosing to invest your energy in things that build you rather than those that destroy you. So the most painful, most effective way to destroy a cruel narcissist isn't loud, dramatic, or even visible. It's silent, consistent, and absolute. You don't fight them. You stop feeding them. And when there's no more supply, there's no more power. They can't survive in that vacuum. But you can. Narcissists rely on what psychologists refer to as narcissistic supply, a constant stream of attention, admiration, emotional reactions, and validation. It doesn't matter whether that reaction is positive or negative. Praise, outrage, adoration, or it's all fuel. This supply functions like oxygen to a narcissist's sense of identity, which is inherently fragile, hollow, and dependent on external validation to survive. Understanding this dynamic is the single most powerful insight you can leverage to dismantle their influence over you. When you engage with a narcissist, arguing, defending yourself, explaining your perspective, or even retaliating. You're feeding the very system they thrive on. You're reinforcing their belief that they matter more, that they have emotional control, that they're capable of pulling your strings. That response, whether it comes from love or anger, gives them the validation they seek. The more intense the emotional energy, the more potent the supply. So paradoxically, even your rage becomes nourishment for them. To cut a narcissist off from this supply is not simply about going no contact. It's about removing the emotional energy you previously gave them, consciously or unconsciously. You must learn to detach internally as well as externally. How do we? That means no longer responding in a way that gives them power. Silence isn't just the absence of words, it's the absence of emotional engagement. It's your nervous system saying, you do not affect me anymore. Neurologically, this is powerful when you stop giving emotional cues. Tone, facial expressions, gestures. The narcissist's brain experiences disorientation. They're constantly scanning for reactions to manipulate. When there's nothing to read, nothing to hijack, they lose grip. This is akin to their psychological foundation cracking. Their need for control goes unmet. And because they lack internal stability, they begin to unravel. Cutting off supply is not revenge. It's survival. It's survival. It's the reassertion of your own nervous system, your own focus, and your own identity. You are saying through your behavior and your stillness, I no longer serve your reality. And that is excruciating for them. They depend on others to reflect their false sense of superiority. Without someone to manipulate, criticize, or idealize, they're left alone with the void they've been avoiding their entire life. The difficult part is that narcissists will escalate when the supply is cut. They will provoke, bait, charm, guilt, trip, or play the victim. This is a critical moment. Your job is to not engage, no matter how tempting it feels to defend your integrity. They want that defense. It signals emotional investment. What they fear most is your complete indifference. Not coldness, not cruelty, but indifferency. It communicates that their power is gone. People often think silence is weakness, but strategically applied, silence is neurological warfare. It disrupts the narcissist's feedback loop. When you stop responding, you interrupt the cycle of validation they need to function. Think of it as cutting off the blood supply to a tumor. The more you withhold your energy, the faster their influence shrinks. What makes this approach even more powerful is that it's rooted in control, not of them, but of yourself. The real work is in training your own mind and body to no longer react. That may mean practicing emotional regulation techniques, deep breathing, somatic awareness, redirecting thoughts, and visualizing your calm state as a fortress. Over time, your system adapts to neutrality. Your reactions no longer betray your inner world. And in the absence of chaos, the narcissist finds nothing to manipulate. Some people ask, isn't that cruel? No, what's cruel is allowing yourself to be exploited over and over. Cutting off supply is an act of protection, not punishment. It's a signal to your own brain that you are done outsourcing your peace. You are done dancing around someone else's dysfunction. You are choosing to invest your energy in things that build you, rather than those that destroy you. So the most painful, most effective way to destroy a cruel narcissist isn't loud, dramatic, or even visible. It's silent, consistent, and absolute them. You stop feeding them. And when there's no more supply, there's no more power. A cruel narcissist's greatest weapon isn't charm or rage. It's their ability to manipulate your emotional state. They study your reactions. They push buttons deliberately to provoke confusion, guilt, fear, or self-doubt. Every tactic they use, gaslighting, projection, blame, shifting, intermittent reinforcement, is aimed at one outcome, getting you to lose control of your emotional center. Because once you react emotionally, they know they've regained control. That's why one of the most effective and deeply disruptive ways to dismantle their influence is to master your own emotional state. Emotional regulation is not just a soft skill, it's a neurological shield. When you maintain control over your internal responses, you strip a narcissist of their most essential tool, your reactivity. Manipulation depends on feedback. Without it, their strategy collapses. They don't know how to navigate a calm, grounded nervous system. They can't control what they can't predict. So your inner stillness becomes a wall they can't climb. To understand how this works, you have to see emotional control not as suppression, but as awareness and mastery. It's not about pretending you don't feel anything. It's about not acting on the emotions they trigger in you. It means recognizing the rise of anger or sadness without letting it spill out where they can use it. You observe your feelings without letting them dictate your behavior. This is what renders their manipulation effective. When you're reactive, shouting back, defending yourself, crying, or explaining endlessly, You're giving them data. They know which topics trigger you. They know what words make you second guess yourself. They learn how to shape your behavior through emotional pressure. Over time, this trains your nervous system to live in a state of chronic stress and hypervigilance. You begin anticipating their moods, censoring yourself, and internalizing their narrative. This is how they gain psychological control, not through brute force, but through the hijacking of your emotional responses. But the moment you begin to regulate your internal state, the game changes. You take back authorship of your emotions. You stop playing the role they wrote for you. This is not just a mental shift, it's a physical one. When you breathe deeply, ground yourself, and stay calm in the face of their provocation, your parasympathetic nervous system activates. That tells your body you are safe, even if your mind is being tested, and safety is power. Narcissists, on the other hand, are dysregulated by nature. They live in emotional chaos, which they try to outsource by inducing chaos in others. Your calmness is not just confusing to them. It's intolerable. It confronts them with their own lack of control. If you remain emotionally still when they expect a reaction, it creates a void they cannot fill. That void forces them to face their own fragility. And that is something they will do anything to avoid. This is why when you become emotionally regulated, you'll see their tactics escalate at first. They may accuse you of being cold, detached, or unloving. They may create a crisis to try to suck you back into emotional engagement. But if you remain centered, if you keep your breathing steady and your words minimal, they begin to realize their usual strategies are no longer effective. One of the strongest examples of emotional regulation is refusing to justify yourself. Narcissists often bait people into long explanations, trying to trap them with logic or morality. But you don't owe an explanation for your boundaries, your silence, or your exit. A simple "I've made my decision," or "I'm not available for this conversation" is enough. When you say less and mean more, you hold the power. Training your emotional system takes time. It means practicing mindfulness, somatic awareness, and breathing techniques. It means learning to sit with discomfort without trying to discharge it through confrontation or appeasement. Over time, you develop what's called emotional resilience, the capacity to experience strong emotions without being controlled by them. This is the state where manipulation fails. What's most important is that emotional control isn't about defeating the narcissist. It's about reclaiming your peace. It's a commitment to no longer living in reaction to someone else's dysfunction. When you master your internal world, you're no longer a puppet in their play. You become the author of your experience. A narcissist cannot manipulate what they cannot move. And when your emotional state becomes anchored steady and self-directed, they lose access to the very thing they relied on most of your reactions. That's when their game ends. And your freedom begins. Boundaries enforced with calm precision are one of the most effective and disorienting responses to a cruel narcissist. Unlike emotional confrontations or dramatic exits, which still feed their need for control, boundaries delivered without apology, anger, or explanation create confusion and frustration at a deep level. This is because narcissists are wired to expect emotional chaos. When you calmly assert a limit and stick to it without emotion, you interrupt their psychological playbook. You're no longer acting out a role in their drama, you're writing your own script, and that shift is deeply threatening to their control. Narcissists thrive on ambiguity and emotional inconsistency. They exploit blurred lines, unspoken expectations, and people's desire to avoid conflict. If you've been involved with a narcissist, you've likely experienced how they push limits, test your tolerance, and subtly erode your boundaries over time. They may challenge your decisions, ignore your preferences, or forget your requests, not because they don't understand them, but because they don't respect them. To a narcissist, a boundary isn't a line to be honored, it's a challenge to be overcome. That's why enforcement is everything. Setting a boundary is not enough. It's the consistent follow-through delivered with emotional neutrality that makes the difference. When you say, "I'm not going to continue this conversation if you raise your voice," and then actually walk away the moment they do, you send a signal they're not used to hearing. Consequences are real, and that signal cuts through their manipulation more than any argument ever could. The power lies in the calmness. If you enforce boundaries through shouting, pleading, or emotional collapse, they'll still feel in control. They'll see that they can provoke a reaction and possibly wear you down. But when you maintain a steady tone, grounded posture, and firm eye contact, or even just walk away without fanfare, you demonstrate control over yourself. And that is exactly what a narcissist cannot stand: someone who controls themselves more than they can be controlled by others. This calm precision confuses them because it creates uncertainty. Narcissists count on being able to predict your emotional patterns. They know which buttons usually trigger a meltdown or get you to backtrack when those patterns no longer apply. When you say no and mean it without drama, they can't map the situation. Their manipulative tactics start to fail. That failure causes frustration, even rage, because they experience it as a loss of dominance. Another reason this approach is so effective is that it forces the narcissist to face a version of you that doesn't need their approval. Calm, precise boundaries communicate, I know what I need, and I don't require your permission to protect it. This challenges their fundamental illusion of superiority. It introduces a reality they've tried to avoiding, that you are a sovereign individual, not a subordinate character in their narrative. It's important to understand that this doesn't mean they will immediately respect your limits. In fact, the opposite often happens at first. Narcissists may escalate, test your boundaries more aggressively, or accuse you of being selfish, cold, or ungrateful. This is where your calmness becomes a form of, you're not enforcing boundaries to get them to agree with you. You're doing it because it's what your well-being requires. And when you maintain that stance with consistency, their influence diminishes. There's a psychological phenomenon known as extinction burst, where behavior that used to get results becomes more extreme when it stops working. You may see this in the form of guilt trips, gaslighting, or even love bombing. But these are just signs that your boundary is working, that the old manipulative pathways are breaking down. So we don't take the bait, stay grounded, reaffirm your limit, and follow through. The key is internal clarity. When you truly believe you are allowed to have limits and you don't owe anyone emotional justification for them, you stop seeking validation for enforcing them. That's when your boundaries become immovable, not loud, not aggressive, just firm, just real. In the end, calm and precise boundary setting isn't just about keeping the narcissist out. It's about keeping yourself intact. It's about proving to your own nervous system that you are no longer living in fear or guilt, that you are no longer sacrificing your peace to maintain someone else's illusion of power. When boundaries are delivered with quiet strength, they act like a mirror to the narcissist, showing them clearly and unmistakably that you are no longer accessible for manipulation. That's not just confusing to them. It's devastating, and it marks the beginning of their loss and your freedom. Exposing the truth without emotional charge is one of the most disarming things you can do when dealing with a cruel narcissist. It bypasses their need for conflict, their hunger for attention, and their reliance on emotional volatility. Narcissists thrive in the fog of confusion, distortion, and emotional reactivity. Their power lies in controlling the narrative, often by provoking extreme reactions that shift attention away from facts and onto feelings. But when you speak the truth clearly, directly, and without any emotional engagement, you cut through the fog. And in doing so, you leave them exposed, vulnerable, and power narcissists depend on emotional intensity. They feed off of your anger, your desperation, and your need to be understood. They bait into emotionally charged situations, knowing that once you're reactive, the focus shifts from what they've done to how you're responding. This is how they avoid accountability. They blur lines. They change the subject. They accuse you of being too sensitive or irrational so they can dodge the actual issue. If you raise your voice or break down emotionally, they'll use that to paint you as unstable while quietly avoiding the truth of their actions. This is why emotional neutrality is so effective. When you calmly state the facts, no accusation, no anger, just the truth, you deny them the chaos they need to maintain control. You take away their ability to twist your words, to deflect from their behavior, or to weaponize your reaction. You leave them with nothing to feed on. Delivering truth in this way requires a kind of internal discipline. You have to be grounded. You have to have clarity. You can't go into the conversation hoping for validation or understanding. You're not trying to get them to admit guilt or show remorse. That's not your goal. Your goal is to honor your own reality, to speak what's real without needing them to agree. This mental posture is essential because narcissists will do everything in their power to shift the ground under your feet. If you remain calm and self-assured, their usual tactics fall flat. Let's say you're confronting them about a lie. If you approach with rage or pain, they'll likely counter with denial, blame shifting, or emotional manipulation. But if you say something like, "I'm aware of what happened. I have the facts. I don't need an explanation," and then say nothing more, you force them into a corner. You're not giving them an opening to manipulate the situation. You're simply naming the truth and walking away from the outcome. That silence, backed by certainty, is far more powerful than any argument. This approach is not about detachment or pretending not to care. It's about containment. You can care deeply and still choose to protect your emotional energy. You can know what's true without demanding that they acknowledge it. When you operate from that space, the truth becomes your boundary. It becomes the line they can't cross. And they know it. What often shocks narcissists is that the truth, when stated plainly, is harder to fight than any accusation. They can argue with emotion. They can argue with character attacks. But they can't easily dismantle calm fact delivered without a charge. The lack of emotional fuel makes them feel exposed and small. They can sense that you're no longer hooked into their drama, and that realization is deeply unsettling for them. Over time, this method of truth telling not only disarms them, it trains your nervous system to stop fearing conflict. You begin to see that your power lies not in how loudly you speak, but in how clearly and calmly you can stand in reality. That's a shift from survival mode to sovereignty. You no longer engage in emotional battles that drain you and go nowhere. You speak once, firmly without anger, and then you let your silence do the rest. This is how you reclaim authority in your own life. Not by trying to win against them, but by refusing to play their game. When you expose the truth without emotional charge, you become immune to their chaos. You're no longer trying to prove anything. You're simply living in it with reality. And there is nothing more dispowering to a narcissist than someone who can calmly, confidently, and consistently do that. In that stillness, in that clarity, their power collapses, not because you destroyed them, but because they have nothing left to control. And that is when you finally walk away. Not with fury, but with freedom. How do we? Redirecting your attention to purpose is not just a healing act. It's a declaration of autonomy. When you shift your mental and emotional focus away from a cruel narcissist and toward your goals, passions, and values, you remove the fuel they need to maintain control over you. Narcissists don't simply thrive on admiration or attention. They survive on distraction. They want your mind entangled in their behavior, your emotions caught in a loop of reaction, and your energy consumed with trying to understand or fix the unfixable. But when you begin to redirect your attention toward meaningful purpose, you create a force field they can't penetrate. Narcissists are drawn to people who care deeply, people with empathy, drive, and emotional richness. They exploit those qualities, slowly shifting your focus away from your identity and onto their needs, moods, and distortions. Over time, your sense of self becomes fragmented. You lose touch with your own goals. You spend more time analyzing their words than acting on your plans. This isn't accidental. It's strategic. They want to be the center of your mental universe because that gives them influence over your choices, your time, and your sense of worth. The most subversive thing you can do in this situation is to stop giving them that power, not by fighting them directly, but by withdrawing your attention. Attention is energy. Wherever your attention goes, your life goes. When you start focusing that energy on growth, on building something meaningful, on healing, on learning, on contributing, whatever your version of purpose is, you are feeding a system that gives back, not one that depletes. You are nourishing your future rather than reinforcing their control. This isn't a matter of distraction or denial. Redirecting your attention to purpose is a conscious act of self-leadership. It requires a clear decision. How do we do? I will no longer center my life around what they did or didn't do. I will no longer orbit their dysfunction. I will build something stronger, something that reflects who I really am. That kind of internal shift creates psychological distance, even if you're still physically near the narcissist. It marks the beginning of the emotional separation that precedes true freedom. From a neurological standpoint, this shift is powerful. When you stop focusing on a narcissist's behavior and begin engaging with purposeful action, you're rewiring your brain. You're activating circuits associated with motivation, reward, and future planning. This helps you step out of survival mode. It lowers stress. It builds resilience. Your nervous system begins to anchor into safety and direction. So instead of reactivity and hypervigilance, this change is not just emotional. It's biological. How do we? One of the reasons narcissists lose power when you find purpose is because you're no longer as reactive to their provocations. When you have something bigger pulling you forward, their attempts to suck you into arguments or drama lose impact. You don't have the time or emotional bandwidth to keep revisiting the same manipulations. You stop explaining yourself. You stop trying to win an unwinnable game. You simply detach and redirect again and again until their presence becomes background noise. Purpose gives your life structure, and structure is exactly what narcissistic influence seeks to destroy. They want you off balance. They want you questioning your instincts, doubting your path. How do we? And revolving around their dysfunction. But when you're grounded in something bigger than the relationship, something personal, meaningful, how do we? And forward-facing, they can no longer move you at will. You become anchored in a different system, one that they have no access to. This doesn't mean they won't try to reinsert themselves. They may suddenly become interested in your goals. They may try to compete with or criticize your direction. They may even accuse you of being selfish for choosing yourself. But those reactions are symptoms of their diminishing power. They know they're losing relevance, and they will do what they can to pull you back. The difference now is that you're not available in the same way. You've reallocated your attention, and that is your shield. In time, the narcissist fades, not necessarily from your life, but from your mind. And that's where the true freedom lies. Because once you stop centering their behavior and start building your own direction, their power withers. They can no longer hold your emotions hostage. They no longer define your reality. The focus on purpose doesn't just starve their influence. It restores your identity. It returns your life to you. And in that return, you find clarity, peace, and strength that can't be manipulated. The narcissist game ends the moment you stop playing. And the moment you start building something real, they cease to matter.